I was fortunate enough to be able to sew my own wedding gown. Thus far, I have shown videos of sewing the corset and how I created my fairy tale skirt shape with a hoop skirt. Then I had a video showing my ruffled petticoat, which smooths the hoops and adds volume, and a smooth petticoat, which smooths the ruffles and gives a little train support. My most recent video had the making of the ivory silk skirt and a sparkly tulle and beaded lace overskirt. So that brings us to this, the final wedding gown video about creating my bodice and veil. So let's get sewing. As I loved the shape of my corset, I started with that pattern to help me visualize my plan to drape my bodice pattern. You can see that one can't just use the same pattern over the top. That doesn't work, but it can be a guide, and I sketched on a potential waistline at the front and back. I traced off a front, leaving lots of room to adjust. With the centre front pinned in place, the top line and seams don't sit directly over the corset seams. So I drew on my new seam line and top edge. Then I pinned on a panel 2 and sketched to refine it. I also added balance marks to these 2 new pattern pieces. I used an app to turn my tablet into a light box and drew out the next 2 pattern piece starting points, which combined the upper halves of corset panels 3 and 4, as well as 5 and 6. This starting point let me then draw on and work out my pattern. I refined my bottom edge and overall was happy with how the pattern pieces were looking. I laid them out on cotton with space for seam allowance at the sides, traced around them and cut them out. The next step was to sew the toile together. So here we are, and I'm pretty happy with it. I think it's going well. The back seems okay. The side seems okay. The only little, and it's sitting pretty well where I want it to as far as following under the bust. The only changes I've made are at the very top of the bust. Pinning it in just very slightly on that first seam, just a teeny tiny bit. And then on the second seam, that needed to come in a fair bit, so I trimmed it down and laid it over. So that will need about 1 centimetre taken out off the top there, and I'll just even up on both sides. So there we are. I might stitch that down and then stick in some bones, sew on a lacing strip and actually try it on. And with the changes I had tweaked on Madam, the bodice was sitting very nicely. I unpicked the toile, then made the changes I had made to it to my pattern pieces. This was currently a net pattern with no seam allowance. So finally, I traced out my pattern pieces, adding 10 millimeters of seam allowance. Piece 1. I also added a facing portion to the back piece. And with that, I had the bodice pattern for my wedding gown.
time to sew the structural lining. I cut out a single piece of the front panel from small weave herringbone couture, and then 2 each of other pieces. So I had a full bodice of pieces. I stitched the front to the second panel and top stitched as I would for a corset, then clipped the seams. I proceeded to add the next panels and then did the same on the other side. As this is a structural lining layer, this is what will be visible inside the bodice. I marked 6 centimeters from the back edge and pressed to allow for sewing bone channels. And here is the structural lining layer of the bodice on Madam. I also decided to add a layer of silk to the back so that no couture would be visible poking around the edge. First sewing right sides together, then folding over and top stitching. I pressed the silk around the fold and pinned it down to just 1 layer of couture. I stitched the silk to the couture at the back edge and just back from the fold to keep it securely in place. Okay, so there we are. Here is a view of what will be the internals of this and what will be seen from the inside of the bodice. So the reason for this is to get a nice silk layer so that if any peeks over at the edge of the bodice, it doesn't stand out awkwardly and it all just blends in suitably. Next, it was time to add bone casing, first to the centre front and then over the bust seams. As the underside of the seam will only be visible on the inside of the garment, I was quite happy to sew down either side of the casing tape from this side. Then I pinned on the remaining bone casings and stitched them down in the middle of panels 3 and 4, leaving room at the bottom and the top for seam allowance to fold down. Next, I marked the placement for the lacing loops at the centre back and stitched down a piece of satin cord while winding back and forth, creating loops. Then I did another line of stitching to hold down the long loops, keeping them out of the way. Here we are, a view of the internals and what will poke out the edge. It was taking shape and very much starting to look like a wedding bodice. Using an offcut of silk from the skirt, I cut out the bodice pieces and marked the balance points. I stitched the front panels together as I did for the structural layer, top stitching and then clipping. I had the front panels sewn together but kept the back panels separate. With the front pinned to Madam, I was worried that the innards were a little bit visible, so I pinned on some tulle to experiment and decided I needed another layer of silk to better match the gathers of the skirt. I tore off a piece of silk to use for the next bodice layer and draped it onto Madam. Then hand-pleated gathers under the bust, getting the front to this, then this, which was pinned onto the base silk layer. I basted the 2 layers together at the sides and along the top. then hand-stitched the pleats into the outer silk layer. This did take some time. I pressed the pleats and trimmed down the top and the bottom. And I also machine basted along that bottom, at which point the inside looked like this, and from the outside, but I realised the left and right didn't quite match. So I pinned the pleats higher and also took the side dart higher. After which, I was quite happy with the shape, and particularly with how it came in under the bust. I started the tulle layer by draping over the bodice and marking where I wanted it gathered. So, probably hard to tell, given that it's just tulle, but from those initial marks I've then pinned on 3 travelling lines of pins for the lines to follow. I stitched my gathering lines into the tulle, which then looked like this. I pinned the tulle onto Madam and started gathering. Then also did the other side. So this is this side, and I'm really very pleased with it. I think it looks quite fetching. This is this side. Look at the curve under the bust. I'm really happy with that. It's pretty good. And I think at this stage, with 1 week and 2 days till the wedding, I just need to press on. I laid out my remaining pieces of the beaded lace and found pairs to be the motifs for the main front and back pieces. I draped my front pieces onto Madam and trimmed off the excess. I stitched the 2 front pieces along the centre front to join them together, and I did have to add in a little bit of piecing, but that's okay. Overall, I think this is looking very pretty. The sides won't be mirror images, but that didn't bother me. I pinned on the beaded lace piece down the centre front and across the top, adjusting and aligning the motifs. I pleated in the bottom of the lace piece, pinning it in place. I decided to use some plain tulle to go over the bottom portion of the bodice. I trimmed off the excess and then adjusted the pins so that the tulle and lace were attached just to the silk layer. I did a line of stitching along the bottom of the beaded lace piece, securing it to the silk. Trimmed off some excess and then pinned on the layer of tulle, before then sewing that into place. I cleared any beads too close to the edges and then machine basted around the edges and trimmed. At which point the front silken lace piece was looking like this from the outside and this from the inside, and sparkled like this when on Madam. For the back panels, I kept it simple and started with 2 pieces of silk, then laid on a layer of tulle. I pinned on the beaded lace, including a little bit of piecing. I stitched the layers together, then pinned the back pieces to the front at the side seam. I stitched and top stitched, so the inside looked like this and the outside looked like this. It was then time to join the structural lining to the outer layer. I used a tailor's ham to roll pin the 2 layers together, top and bottom, to be sure that I had the back edges where they needed to be. Then I marked those edges and removed the other pins. And I was then able to accurately pin the 2 layers together. I stitched the back seam on one side and then did the same on the other. Then, keeping the silk and lace layers out of the way, I stitched through the 2 layers of couture to create a bone channel, and then also stitched further along to secure the facing edge. Once the back edges were finished, I was able to repin the top and bottom. I cut strips of silk on the bias to use as binding. I pinned 1 strip to the bottom edge of the bodice, stitched the strip on by machine, and trimmed down the seam allowance. Then I folded the bias binding around, folding it to be completely on the inside, and pinned it into place. I then stitched by hand from the inside so no stitches were visible from the outside. The bottom edge was done, smooth on the outside and neat on the inside. I tried everything on to see how the bodice was fitting on me. I was really happy with the lines, and I just needed the top 5 to 7 millimeters to be folded down as planned. I cut and inserted the bones, flat steel at the back and synthetic whalebone elsewhere. I basted along the top edge. Then it was time to cut tulle for my sleeves. I pinned tulle to the back to work out what I wanted, but having too much felt very 80s and not the modern fairy tale soft drape that I was after. So I decided to go for a single layer of tulle, which I attached to the top edge of the bodice. Okay, I've sewed it on, basted, tacked, used a long stitch to sew it on front and back. I'm happy with it. It's certainly nice and mobile, it's comfortable. If anything, it's slightly on the loose side, but I'm happy with that because once I actually finish the edges and turn it in, that might take a little bit more out of it. So I think this is good. Time to bind the edge. I stitched on a strip of silk bias to the top edge. I trimmed down the overhang, then folded and pinned the bias binding around to the inside. Then I stitched it down to secure, just catching the couture lining and not the outer silk and lace layer. I also stitched down the lace to the couture at the centre front. At which point the main body of the bodice was complete and looked like this from the outside, and this from the inside. The final component of the bodice was the Modesty Panel. So I cut out a piece of silk, 2 pieces of couture, as well as 2 pieces of tulle. I basted the silk and tulle to one of the pieces of couture. I marked the location for the bone channels as per the pattern I had made, and I pinned on the ribbon to the centre. Then I thread marked the bone channels and clipped on the second layer of couture. I stitched the bone channels as I would for a corset modesty panel, following around the thread marks and securing the ribbon in place as it is sewn over. I marked the rounded corners and stitched on bias binding to a short edge. Then folded it over and stitched again. I added in 2 vertical bones, then applied the next strip of bias, folding and stitching it down too. Then I applied bias to the first long edge, and for the sides, which will not be visible, I just folded the strip of bias over and stitched in the ditch to keep the bulk to a minimum. Then I added in the horizontal bones at the top and bottom of the Modesty Panel and sitting under the vertical bones. I bound the final edge pinned down the bias binding, then stitched in the ditch. The completed Modesty panel looked like this. Then it was time for the meditative process of threading through the ribbon, passing into both the loops on the bodice and the ribbon on the Modesty panel, securing all the pieces together. I trimmed off the ends of the ribbon and the bodice was finished. I am extremely happy with how my wedding bodice came out. I love the sparkle of the beaded lace and the elegance of the lace-up back. I am happy with the shape I achieved and my delicate off-the-shoulder sleeve. Overall, I was delighted. I decided to make a fingertip-length veil with a 30-inch blusher and a 42-inch main body, and gathered in the centre into a hair comb. So I cut off a piece of tulle and rounded the corners. To check that I was happy, I held it up to see what it was like. And yes, I was excited and happy to proceed. I used 2 tapestry needles to create parallel lines of gathering stitches. I gathered my tulle and stitched it onto my hair comb. I was happy with the shape it was creating. When collecting wedding fabric, this was the beaded lace remnant, the edge of which had screamed veil to me when I found it. I was working on the veil over the same few months that I created the gown, and as the gown came into life, the heavily beaded veil seemed less and less right for my light and floaty wedding look. It also took an absolute age. So I decided to put the beaded veil aside and make an extra wide floaty tulle veil. I unrolled my tulle again and cut off another 72 inches, but this time the full width of 120 inches of the roll. I cut off the corners. I marked the centre line and the gathering line that divides the blusher from the main body of the veil. This time I gathered by machine, and that worked just as well. It was almost as smooth, and it was much faster. I gathered the tulle and attached it to the hair comb. If you've made it this far, thank you so very much for watching. My wonderful husband Aidan is my #1 supporter, and I'm so lucky to have him cheering me on. And it also means a lot to have you here too. Creating my own wedding gown was an absolute privilege and joy, and I'm thrilled that I have been able to share the process. If you have any questions about any of my wedding gown components, please do feel free to post them in the comments. Do you have a gown project coming up? Please do let me know what you're planning. This is the last video in my wedding gown series, but there will be other sewing and crafting projects soon, and I hope you can join me again next time. Goodbye.